Era pressed her back against the cool stone wall of the kitchen and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The mating ceremony had begun an hour ago in the great hall, just beyond the heavy oak doors. She could hear the music, the low hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter. Every eligible wolf in the Crescent Valley pack had been summoned. Everyone except her, it seemed, though the oversight had been her own doing. She glanced down at her hands, rough from years of kitchen work, and curled her fingers into her palms. The thin, white scar that traced from her left temple to her jaw caught the firelight. She'd stopped seeing it in mirrors years ago, but she knew others hadn't. It marked her as the girl who'd survived the raid that took her parents. The girl who'd been pulled from the rubble with ash in her lungs and blood on her face. She was 23 now, old enough to know better than to hope. The head cook had told her to stay behind and prepare the morning bread. Ara had nodded, relieved. It was easier to knead dough than to stand in a line of women who glowed with anticipation, their hair braided with ribbons, their dresses embroidered anew. Ara owned 2 dresses. One was patched at the hem. The other was the one she wore now, plain gray wool that hung loose at her shoulders and skimmed her ankles without ceremony. She turned back to the wooden counter and dusted flour across the surface, her movements steady and practiced. The rhythm of her hands soothed her. Knead, fold, press. Knead, fold, press. It was a small world, this kitchen, but it was hers. No one stared here. No one whispered. The door creaked open behind her. Era froze, her palms flattening against the dough. She didn't turn. Perhaps it was the cook returning early, or one of the younger girls sent to fetch more wine. But the scent that reached her was nothing like the herbs and yeast that clung to the kitchen. It was cedar and night air, cool and wild, threaded with something darker she couldn't name. Her wolf stirred inside her, a creature that had been quiet for so long. Ara had almost forgotten it had a voice. She turned slowly, flour dusting her fingers, her heart climbing into her throat. The man standing in the doorway was taller than anyone she'd ever seen. Broad shoulders filled the frame, and the firelight caught the sharp lines of his face, all angles and quiet intensity. His hair was dark, nearly black, cropped short enough to reveal the strong line of his jaw. His eyes were gray, pale as winter smoke, and they fixed on her with a focus that made her forget to breathe. He wore the formal tunic of the ceremony, deep charcoal embroidered with silver thread along the collar and cuffs. The mark of the alpha bloodline sat at his throat, a crescent moon inked in black. She knew who he was before he spoke. Everyone did. Kale, the Alpha King, unmated, 30 years old, unsmiling. Ara's hands trembled. She wiped them quickly on her apron, her gaze dropping to the floor. She should bow. She should say something. She should explain why she was here, instead of in the hall where she was supposed to be. But her voice had disappeared. Kale stepped into the kitchen and closed the door behind him with a soft click. The sound felt impossibly loud in the quiet. He didn't speak right away. He simply stood there, his gaze steady, and Ara felt the weight of it like a hand against her chest. "You're not at the ceremony," he said finally. His voice was low, calm, and carried no accusation. Ara swallowed and forced herself to meet his eyes. It was harder than she expected. His gaze didn't waver, didn't dart away the way others did when they caught sight of her scar. "No," she managed. Her voice came out softer than she intended. "I'm not." He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Why?" The question was simple, but it struck something fragile inside her. She looked away, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her apron. How could she explain it to him? How could she tell the Alpha King that she'd hidden because she was afraid of being overlooked, or worse, pitied? "I didn't think." She paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound too raw. I didn't think I belonged there." Kale took another step forward, and Ara's breath caught. He moved with the quiet grace of someone who'd spent his life in control, every motion deliberate. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his gaze softened just slightly as he studied her. "Why not?" he asked again, and this time his voice held something gentler. Ara's throat tightened. She wanted to look away again, but something in his expression held her. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't dismissing her. He was waiting, patient and still, as though her answer mattered. "Because I'm not." She gestured vaguely at herself, at the flower on her hands and the scar on her face and the plain dress that hung on her like a borrowed coat. "I'm not what anyone would choose." The words came out quieter than she meant, but they carried the weight of years. Years of standing at the edge of gatherings, of watching others pair off while she scrubbed pots and swept floors. Years of telling herself it didn't matter, that she didn't need what everyone else seemed to find so easily. Kale's expression shifted, something almost like surprise flickering across his face. He stepped closer still, and Ara's wolf stirred again, restless and uncertain. "That's not true," he said, and his voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. Ara blinked, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to ask him what he meant, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't imagine why the Alpha King would contradict her, why he would stand here in the kitchen instead of the great hall where dozens of women waited, hoping to catch his eye. Kale lifted his hand slowly, as though giving her time to step back if she wanted. When she didn't move, he reached out and brushed a smudge of flour from her cheek with the edge of his thumb. The touch was so gentle it made her chest ache. "I came looking for you," he said, and his gray eyes held hers without flinching. "Your scent. I followed it here." Ara's breath left her in a rush. She stared at him, disbelief warring with something fragile and unfamiliar blooming beneath her ribs. "Why?" she whispered. Kale's mouth curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to soften the hard lines of his face. "Because," he said simply, "I wanted to find the woman it belonged to." The kitchen was silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Ara's hands were still trembling, but she didn't move. She couldn't. She stood there, caught in the weight of his gaze, and for the first time in years, she felt something other than invisible. Kale didn't look away. He didn't rush her. He simply waited, as though he had all the time in the world, as though she was worth waiting for. And in that moment, Ara thought maybe, just maybe, she might believe him. Ara's fingers curled into the fabric of her apron, grounding herself against the surge of feeling that threatened to spill over. She studied his face, searching for the catch, the moment when his expression would shift and she'd see the truth beneath the kindness. But Kale's gaze remained steady, patient in a way that made her throat tighten. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are so many others, women who know how to walk through a hall without stumbling, who don't smell like bread dough and dishwater." She said it plainly, without bitterness. It was simply fact. She had spent years watching those women, the ones who laughed easily and wore their confidence like a second skin, the ones who belonged in rooms like the Great Hall, who wouldn't dream of hiding in the kitchen while their futures unfolded somewhere else. Kale's hand dropped from her cheek, but he didn't step back. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, considering her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Why did you hide tonight?" he asked, and the question was gentle but direct. "You were invited. You belong to this pack." Ara felt heat rise to her face, and she looked down at the worn wooden floor. The grain of the boards blurred in her vision. "Because I knew what would happen," she said quietly. "I'd stand there with everyone else, and you'd walk past. Your eyes would move right over me, the way they always do. And I'd go back to the kitchen anyway, but with everyone knowing I'd tried and failed." The words tasted like ash, but they were true. She had imagined it a dozen times in the days leading up to the ceremony. The weight of hopeful silence. The moment when the Alpha King's gaze swept the crowd and landed on someone beautiful, someone whole. The collective exhale of relief and disappointment that wouldn't include her name. It seemed easier, she continued, lifting her eyes to his again, to just stay here, to choose it for myself. Kale was quiet for a long moment, and Ara watched something shift in his expression. Not pity, which she would have hated, but understanding. It settled in the lines around his mouth, in the way his shoulders softened just slightly. "I know what it is to feel that," he said, and his voice carried a weight that caught her off guard. "To decide solitude is safer than disappointment." Ara blinked. She hadn't expected that. The Alpha King, strong and certain and chosen by the moon herself, understanding loneliness? It seemed impossible. But when she looked at him, really looked, she saw the faint shadows beneath his eyes. The set of his jaw that spoke of burdens carried quietly. The careful distance he seemed to hold even as he stood close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "You?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop it. Kale's mouth curved, but it wasn't quite a smile. It was something sadder, something that made her chest ache in a way she didn't fully understand. "Being king doesn't mean you're not alone," he said simply. "Sometimes it means the opposite." Ara's hands relaxed slightly in her apron. She wanted to ask more, to understand what he meant, but she wasn't sure she had the right. They were strangers, really. Strangers standing in a kitchen while the world went on without them just beyond the walls. "I hid because I was afraid," she said instead, offering him the truth he'd given her. "Not just of being overlooked, of being seen and found wanting, of someone looking at me the way you're looking at me now and realizing I'm not enough." She gestured to the scar on her temple, the raised line that cut through her eyebrow and disappeared into her hairline. "This happened when I was 12, a training accident. Everyone said it would fade, but it didn't. And my rank," she swallowed. "I'm Omega-born. My parents served in the lower house. I work here because it's all I know how to do." The shame she'd carried for years sat heavy in her throat, but she forced herself to keep his gaze. If he was going to walk away, better now than later. Better before she let herself hope. But Kale didn't move. He listened, his full attention on her as though every word mattered. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke. "I see a woman," he said slowly, "who works with her hands and doesn't ask for recognition, who chose honesty over performance, who stands here telling me the truth even though she's afraid." His eyes didn't leave hers. "I see a scar that tells me you've survived something painful, that you kept going. I see flour on your hands because you were working while others were primping. And when I breathe—" He paused, and his voice dropped lower, rougher. "I smell honey and wood smoke and something warm I can't name, but it called me here. It pulled me away from a hall full of people and led me to you." Ara's breath hitched. The words landed in her chest like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through every doubt she'd carried. She wanted to believe him. The way he said it with such quiet certainty made it hard not to. "I don't understand why," she whispered. "You could have anyone." Kale's jaw tightened just slightly and he shook his head. "No," he said. "I could have anyone willing to stand in that hall and hope to be chosen, but that's not the same as choosing for myself." He took a slow breath. "I didn't feel anything in that room. Not until your scent reached me, and then I couldn't think of anything else." His honesty was almost too much. Ara felt the weight of it pressing against the walls she'd built around herself. Walls meant to keep disappointment out and her heart safe. "What do you want from me?" she asked, and her voice shook just slightly. Kale's expression gentled. "Right now," he said, I want to know your name." The simplicity of it startled a soft, breathless laugh out of her. "Ara," she said. "My name is Ara. Ara." He repeated it carefully, as though testing the shape of it, and then he smiled, a real smile this time, small and warm and directed only at her. "I'm Kale." "I know," she said, and felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Everyone knows." "Then we're uneven," he said lightly. "Because I didn't know you. But I'd like to." Ara's heart beat hard and unsteady in her chest. She searched his face again, looking for the crack, the moment when this would reveal itself as some kind of mistake. But all she saw was patience, warmth, a quiet intensity that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know what you expect." Kale's hand lifted again, slowly, and this time he let it rest gently on her shoulder. The touch was light, grounding without demanding. "I don't expect anything," he said, "except maybe that you'll let me stay here a little longer and talk with me." Ara exhaled, and something in her chest loosened just slightly. "I can do that," she said quietly. "Good." Kale's thumb brushed once against her shoulder before his hand dropped away. "Then let's start there." And for the first time that night, Ara felt her fear begin to ease, replaced by something tentative and fragile but undeniably real: hope. Kale's hand dropped away from her shoulder, but the warmth of it lingered. He glanced toward the kitchen door, then back to her, his expression thoughtful. "Would you walk with me?" he asked. Ara's breath caught. "Walk?" "The garden," he said. "It's quiet this time of night, and cooler than in here." She hesitated, her pulse quickening. The garden meant leaving the safety of the kitchen. It meant being seen, possibly, by anyone who might pass by. But it also meant time. Space. A chance to understand if this moment was real or just some strange fluke of circumstance. "All right," she said softly. Kale's smile returned, gentle and unhurried. He stepped back to give her room, then waited as she smoothed her hands down the front of her apron and removed it with unsteady fingers. She folded it carefully and set it on the counter, aware of how ordinary the gesture was and how surreal everything else felt. He moved to the door and opened it for her, the hinges creaking softly in the stillness. Ara stepped through, and the cool night air touched her skin like a blessing. The heat of the kitchen fell away, replaced by the scent of earth and flowers and the faint rustle of leaves. The garden stretched out before them, bathed in silver moonlight. Stone paths wound between low hedges and beds of night-blooming jasmine. Lanterns hung at intervals, their flames barely flickering in the calm air. It was beautiful, peaceful, and entirely empty. Kale fell into step beside her, his presence solid and steady. He didn't try to take her hand or guide her. He simply walked, his pace matching hers, his silence comfortable rather than heavy. They passed beneath an archway covered in climbing roses, and Ara felt herself begin to relax, bit by bit. The tension she'd carried all evening slowly unwound from her shoulders. "I used to come here when I was younger," Kale said after a while. His voice was low, almost reflective. "When the council meetings ran too long, or the expectations felt too much." Ara glanced at him, surprised. "You hid too?" He huffed a quiet laugh. "In a way. I didn't call it that at the time. I told myself I was thinking, planning. But really, I just needed a place where no one was watching." She hadn't expected that. Hadn't imagined that someone like him, someone who seemed so certain and composed, would understand the need to disappear. "It's different for you, though," she said carefully. People watch you because they admire you, because they need you. Kale's expression shifted, something darker passing through his eyes. They watch because they expect things, he said. And sometimes those expectations feel more like walls than windows. Aura studied him as they walked, taking in the tension at the corners of his mouth, the way his shoulders carried weight even here, in the quiet. She saw the king in him, but she also saw something else. Something tired, lonely. Do you ever wish you could just be someone else? She asked. He turned his head toward her, and for a moment the moonlight caught the gold in his eyes. All the time, he said honestly. But I can't. So I learned to find moments where I could just be myself instead. Like tonight. They reached a bench beneath a willow tree, its branches hanging low and trailing in the soft breeze. Kale gestured to it, and Aura sat, the cool stone grounding beneath her. He settled beside her, leaving enough space that she didn't feel crowded, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "What about you?" he asked. "Have you always worked in the kitchens?" Aura nodded. "Since I was old enough to help. My mother worked there before me. She taught me everything." "Is she still?" "No." The word came quietly. "She passed 3 winters ago." Kale's expression softened with immediate understanding. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." Aura folded her hands in her lap, the old ache settling over her chest. She was kind, patient. She never made me feel like I wasn't enough, even when others did. "And your father?" "Gone, before I was born." Aura looked down at her hands. "I don't know anything about him. My mother never spoke of it." Kale was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentler still. "My mother died when I was 12, he said. "An illness. It came quickly, and there was nothing anyone could do." Aura's gaze lifted to his face, and she saw the old grief there, worn smooth by time but never fully erased. "I'm sorry," she said, echoing his words back to him. He nodded once, his throat working briefly. "My father followed her 2 years later. The healers said it was his heart, but I think he just couldn't bear being without her." The weight of that settled between them, heavy and honest. Aura felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy. He understood loss. He knew what it was to carry absence like a shadow. "That's why you were alone in that hall tonight, isn't it?" she said quietly, "even with everyone watching." Kale's jaw tightened, and he looked away toward the trees. "Yes," he admitted. "I've been alone for a long time, surrounded by people, but still alone." Aura's heart ached for him, sharp and unexpected. She'd thought loneliness was something only people like her felt. People without status or beauty or worth. But here he was, a king, and he carried the same hollow ache she did. "I thought tonight would be like all the others," Kale continued. "Another ceremony, another room full of faces I didn't recognize, another failure to feel anything that mattered." He turned back to her, his eyes searching hers. "And then you were there, and everything changed." "I wasn't even supposed to be seen," Aura whispered. "Maybe that's why I saw you." His voice was soft, almost wondering. "Because you weren't performing. You weren't trying to be chosen. You were just yourself." She didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to explain that being herself had always felt like the least valuable thing she could offer. "I've spent so long believing I wasn't worth noticing," she said finally. "That the scar, the rank, the plainness, that it all added up to someone forgettable." Kale shook his head slowly. "You're not forgettable, Aura." The way he said her name sent warmth curling through her chest. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this wasn't some fleeting kindness that would fade with the morning. "I'm afraid," she admitted. the words slipping out before she could stop them. Of what? That this is too much. Too fast. That I'll wake up tomorrow and realize it was just a mistake. Cale leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze never leaving hers. I can't promise you won't be afraid, he said, but I can promise you this isn't a mistake, not for me. Ara's breath shook as she exhaled. She looked at him, at the sincerity written across every line of his face, and felt something fragile but undeniable take root inside her. I don't know how to do this, she said again. Neither do I, Cale said, but maybe we can figure it out together. The breeze stirred the willow branches above them, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called softly. Ara felt the fear still there, curled tight in her chest, but beneath it, stronger now, was hope. All right, she whispered. Cale's smile returned, slow and genuine, and the warmth of it wrapped around her like a promise she almost believed. The walk back from the garden was quieter than Ara expected. The sounds of the ceremony had faded, most guests drifting toward the great hall where wine and conversation would stretch into the early hours. Cale walked beside her, close enough that his warmth reached her through the cool night air, but he didn't touch her. She appreciated that, the space to breathe, the chance to let her racing heart settle. They rounded the corner of the east wing, heading toward the central courtyard, where lamplight pooled golden on the stone. Ara could see a handful of people still gathered near the fountain, their voices low and musical. She recognized some of them. Pack members of higher rank. Families who'd attended the ceremony with daughters dressed in silk and carefully arranged smiles. One of them turned as they approached. Elder Marin, tall and sharp-featured, with silver threading through her dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. She stood with two others, both dressed in the formal robes of the council, and her gaze landed on Ara with a weight that made her steps falter. Cale noticed. His hand brushed hers, just a whisper of contact, and kept walking. Elder Marin stepped forward, blocking their path with the ease of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Your Majesty, she said, her voice smooth and cold as polished marble. We were beginning to wonder where you'd gone. I needed air, Cale replied evenly. The ceremony was crowded. Marin's gaze flicked to Ara, lingering on her face with open assessment. Ara felt the scar on her cheek burn under the scrutiny, a familiar shame curling in her chest. She resisted the urge to turn away, to drop her eyes and make herself small. I see, Marin said. And you found company. There was something in the way she said it, a sharpness that cut beneath the courtesy. Ara's stomach tightened. I did, Cale said. His tone didn't shift, but Ara heard the steel beneath it. Her name is Ara. Marin's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Yes, I know who she is. She turned her attention fully to Ara now, and the air between them seemed to chill. Kitchen staff, aren't you? Low rank, no family of note. Ara's throat closed. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. This was the voice she'd heard all her life, the one that weighed and measured and found her lacking. Elder Marin, Cale said quietly. We were just... And that scar, Marin continued, as though he hadn't spoken. Her eyes traced the line across Ara's cheek with clinical precision. A childhood accident, I assume? Unfortunate. Such marks can be difficult to overlook. The world seemed to narrow to that single point. The scar. The thing Ara had carried like a brand, a visible reminder of everything she wasn't. She felt her hands curl into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms. Enough. Kale's voice was calm, but it carried a force that made Marin's gaze snap back to him. "You've made your point." Marin straightened, her expression cooling further. "Have I, Your Majesty? Because from where I stand, it seems you've allowed yourself to be distracted." She gestured toward Ara with one elegant hand. "By someone entirely unsuitable." The other council members had drawn closer now, watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to disapproval. Ara felt their stares like needles, each one a confirmation of what she'd always believed, that she didn't belong here, that this moment with Kale had been a beautiful mistake. "Unsuitable," Kale repeated, the words slow and deliberate. "In what way?" Marin blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "In every way that matters, Your Majesty. Rank, lineage, appearance." Her gaze flicked to Ara again. "She is not the caliber of mate an Alpha King requires. Surely you see that." Ara's chest ached. She wanted to run, to disappear back into the kitchen where she understood her place, where no one expected more from her than clean hands and a quiet voice. But Kale's presence beside her was steady, grounding, and she found herself unable to move. "What I see," Kale said, his voice low and carrying across the courtyard, "is a woman who showed me more honesty in 10 minutes than I've received in 10 years of ceremonies." Marin's mouth tightened. "Honesty is not the same as suitability." "No," Kale agreed. "It's rarer and far more valuable." A murmur ran through the small crowd that had begun to gather. Ara saw faces turning toward them, curiosity sharpening into attention. Her pulse hammered in her throat. This was spiraling beyond anything she'd imagined, beyond anything she knew how to navigate. "Your Majesty," Marin said, her tone hardening, "I understand the appeal of novelty, but you have a responsibility to this pack, to choose a mate who can stand beside you, who can represent the strength and dignity of your line." She glanced at Ara, dismissive. "Not someone who hides in kitchens and bears the marks of carelessness." The words landed like stones. Ara felt them settle in her chest, heavy and cold. She opened her mouth, some fragment of protest forming, but Kale spoke first. "You're right." His voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmurs like a blade. "I do have a responsibility." Ara's heart sank. Of course he would see sense now. The elder had laid it out plainly, all the reasons Ara wasn't enough, and he would step back and thank her politely for the evening, and that would be the end of it. But Kale turned to face the crowd fully, his posture shifting into something formal and unmistakable. Authority, command. "My responsibility," he continued, "is to lead this pack with integrity, to value what is real over what is convenient, to choose connection over expectation." He looked at Marin, his gaze steady and unyielding. "And I will not allow you or anyone else to diminish someone I've chosen to know simply because she doesn't fit your vision of worthiness." The courtyard went silent. Even the fountain seemed to still, the sound of water fading into the background. Ara stared at Kale, unable to process what she was hearing. Marin's expression froze, shock flickering beneath her composure. "Your Majesty, I only meant—" "I know what you meant," Kale said. "And I'm telling you it doesn't matter." He turned to Ara, his eyes finding hers with a warmth that made her breath catch. "Ara has worth, not because of rank or appearance or anything else you've decided to measure, but because she's kind and brave and honest in a way that matters." Ara felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back, her throat too tight to speak. Kale looked back at the crowd, at the council members and the gathered pack, and his voice carried across the stone. "I intend to know her better, and anyone who has a problem with that can bring it to me directly." No one spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air, a line drawn that no one seemed willing to cross. Marin's jaw tightened, her hands folding neatly in front of her. "As you wish, Your Majesty," she said, her tone clipped. She inclined her head stiffly and stepped back, her gaze sliding away from Ara as though she no longer existed. The crowd began to disperse slowly, murmurs rising and fading as people drifted back toward the hall. Ara stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Cale turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" She shook her head, then nodded, then shook it again. I don't know." He smiled faintly. "That's fair." "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes," Cale said gently. "I did." Ara looked at him, her chest still tight, her pulse refusing to settle. The courtyard felt too open now, too exposed, even with most of the crowd gone. She could still feel their eyes on her, the weight of their judgment lingering like smoke. Cale's gaze never wavered. He stood close enough that she could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, and somehow that small sound anchored her. "Why?" she asked softly. He tilted his head slightly. "Why? What? Why did you say all of that?" Her voice cracked, and she hated how fragile it sounded. "Why? Defend me like that when you barely know me?" Cale was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he glanced around the courtyard, at the empty benches and the fountains still trickling softly in the background. "Would you walk with me?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. He led her away from the fountain, toward the far edge of the garden where the stone pathway narrowed and the flowers grew wild along the edges. The moonlight softened everything here, turning the world gentle and quiet. They walked in silence for a while. Ara's hands twisted together in front of her, her fingers trembling slightly. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make sense of what had just happened. Cale spoke first. "I didn't do it because I barely know you," he said. "I did it because I want to know you, and I couldn't let them take that chance away before it even began." Ara swallowed hard. "But you're the Alpha King. You could have anyone. Someone who fits. Someone the pack would accept without question." "I could," Cale agreed. "But that's not what I want." She looked up at him, her throat tight. "Then what do you want?" He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. The moonlight caught his eyes, and she saw something there that made her chest ache. Something steady and sure and terrifyingly real. "I want someone who sees past the title," he said quietly. "Someone who doesn't look at me and see only power or duty or expectation. Someone who talks to me the way you did tonight. Like I'm just a person." Ara's breath hitched. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful." "You weren't," Cale said gently. "You were honest. And that's rare." She shook her head, her hands still twisting. "But I'm not. I don't belong in your world. I barely belong in my own." Cale's expression softened, and he took a careful step closer. "Do you want to know what I see when I look at you?" She didn't answer, afraid of what he might say. "I see someone who's been told she isn't enough," Cale said, over and over, until she started to believe it. "But I also see someone who still shows up, who still tries, who hides in a kitchen instead of running away completely, because some part of her still hopes." Ara's vision blurred, and she blinked hard, forcing the tears back. "I see strength," Cale continued. "Not the loud kind that demands attention, the quiet kind that endures. And I see kindness, the kind that doesn't need a reason or a reward." She shook her head again, her voice barely a whisper. "You're wrong." "I'm not," he said simply. Ara looked down at her hands, at the faint tremor still running through them. She wanted to believe him. She wanted it so badly it hurt. But the fear was louder, the old wounds deeper. "What if I disappoint you?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What if you get to know me and realize I'm exactly what they said I am?" Cale was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he took her hand gently, his palm warm against hers. "Then you'll disappoint me," he said, "and we'll figure it out from there." She stared at their joined hands, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. "I'm not asking you to be perfect," Cale said. "I'm not asking you to prove anything. I'm just asking for the chance to know you, to see who you are when you're not hiding, when you're not measuring yourself against someone else's expectations." Ara's throat tightened, and she felt the tears spill over before she could stop them. She pulled her hand back, wiping at her face quickly, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm not usually like this." "It's all right," Cale said softly. She shook her head, still trying to collect herself. I don't understand why you'd choose this. Why you'd choose someone who makes everything harder." Cale's smile was small and sad. "Because I've spent my whole life making the easy choice, the expected one. And it's never made me happy." Ara looked up at him, her breath unsteady. "I don't want easy," Cale said. "I want real. And you feel real to me, Ara. More real than anything has in a long time." The words settled over her like a blanket, warm and overwhelming. She didn't know how to hold them, didn't know how to believe them, but something inside her ached to try. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," Cale said gently. What if you're wrong about me? What if this is just pity?" Cale stepped closer, his voice steady and sure. "It's not pity. I promise you that." Ara searched his face, looking for any hint of doubt, any flicker of hesitation. But all she saw was patience, understanding, and something deeper, something that made her heart race and her breath catch. "I need time," she whispered. "Then take it," Cale said. "As much as you need." She shook her head slowly. "But the pack, the council, they're not going to just accept this." "I don't need them to accept it," Cale said. "I need you to accept it. That's all that matters to me." Ara felt her chest tighten, a fresh wave of emotion crashing over her. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear before this moment could break her open any further. But Cale's gaze held her steady, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't feel alone. "Can I see you again?" Cale asked softly. She hesitated, her heart warring with her fear. "Just once more," he said. "No expectations, no pressure, just a chance." Ara looked at him, at the quiet hope in his eyes, and felt something inside her shift, something small and fragile, but real. "Okay," she whispered. Cale's smile was slow and warm, and it made her chest ache in a way she didn't fully understand. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, unable to speak. They stood there for a moment longer, the garden quiet around them, the moonlight soft on their faces. And for the first time since the ceremony began, Ara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she'd always thought. The morning air felt different when Ara woke, cooler, clearer, as though the world had shifted overnight and left her standing on unfamiliar ground. She dressed slowly, her hands unsteady, as she pulled on the simple gray tunic she always wore. Her reflection in the small, cracked mirror showed the same face she'd seen every day of her life, the same scar tracing her cheekbone, the same wary eyes. But something inside her had changed, something small and terrifying and impossible to name. Kale had asked to see her again, and she had said yes. The thought made her chest tight and her pulse quick. She wasn't sure if it was fear or hope or some fragile blend of both. She stepped outside into the cool morning light, intending to slip quietly back to the kitchens before anyone noticed her absence. But the moment she rounded the corner of the stone hall, she stopped. The courtyard was full. Pack members stood in scattered clusters, their voices low and curious. Elders gathered near the center steps, their expressions sharp and watchful. And at the top of the wide stone stairs, his posture calm and his gaze steady, stood Kale. He was dressed simply, no ceremonial robes or crown, just dark clothing that fit him well and made him look strong and grounded. His eyes found hers across the space, and he smiled. Small, warm, certain. Ara's breath caught. She wanted to run, to turn and disappear before this moment became something she couldn't take back. But Kale's gaze held her, and her feet wouldn't move. He descended the steps slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The crowd parted for him, murmurs rippling through the gathered wolves like wind through tall grass. When he reached her, he stopped just close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the steadiness that always seemed to surround him like a quiet promise. "Good morning," he said softly. "Good morning," Ara whispered, her voice shaking. Kale's gaze searched hers for a moment, and then he turned to face the crowd. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and clear and carried across the courtyard with the kind of authority that needed no sharpness. "I want everyone here to know something," Kale said. "I've made my choice." The murmurs stilled, every eye in the courtyard fixed on him, tense and waiting. Kale extended his hand toward Ara, palm up, his expression open and patient. She stared at his hand, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must hear it. Her mind screamed at her to step back, to hide, to protect herself before this all came crashing down. But Kale's eyes were steady, and his hand didn't waver. Slowly, trembling, Ara placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and sure, and the simple contact made her chest ache. Kale turned back to the crowd, still holding her hand, and when he spoke again, his voice was firm and gentle all at once. "Ara is under my protection," he said, "and under my courtship. Anyone who questions her place here questions me." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Ara could feel the weight of every stare, the shock and confusion and disapproval pressing in on her from all sides. But Kale's hand held hers steady, and he didn't look away from the crowd. One of the elders, a tall woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, stepped forward. Her voice was cold and measured. "Alpha King," she said, "with respect, this is irregular. The ceremony was meant to present suitable matches. This girl is—" "Her name is Ara," Kale interrupted, his tone still calm but edged with something harder now. "And she is more than suitable." The elder's jaw tightened. "She is scarred, low-ranked. She has no standing in this pack." "She is standing now," Kale said, simply. Another elder, an older man with a lined face and wary eyes, spoke up. "The council has a right to advise you on matters of succession. This choice could weaken." "My choice strengthens me," Kale said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "Because I've chosen someone who sees me. Not my title, not my bloodline, me." He glanced down at Ara, and the warmth in his gaze made her breath catch. "That matters more than any council approval ever could," Kale said. The crowd shifted, uneasy murmurs rising again. Ara felt exposed, pinned under the weight of too many eyes, too much judgment. Her instinct was to pull away, to run before this moment shattered and left her bleeding. But Kale's hand tightened gently around hers, grounding her. I know some of you don't understand this, Kale continued, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. And I'm not asking you to. I'm telling you how it is. Ara is mine to protect, mine to court, and anyone who harms her, in word or action, answers to me. The words settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket, undeniable and final. Ara's throat tightened. She didn't know what to do with the fierce protectiveness in his voice, the way he stood between her and the judgment of an entire pack without hesitation. The silver-haired elder opened her mouth to speak again, but another voice cut through the tension. Then we bear witness. It was an older man, standing near the edge of the crowd. His voice was rough but steady, and his eyes were kind. If the Alpha King has declared his intent, the man continued, then we witness it. That is our duty. A few heads nodded. Slowly, reluctantly, more voices murmured agreement. The elders looked displeased, but they said nothing more. The crowd began to disperse, still whispering, still watching, but the sharp edge of confrontation had dulled. Kale waited until most of them had gone before he turned to Ara, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Ara shook her head, then nodded, then shook it again. I don't know." "That's fair," Kale said gently. She looked up at him, her chest tight and her throat thick with emotion she didn't know how to name. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes, I did," Kale said simply. "They're going to hate me now." "Maybe," Kale admitted, "but they won't hurt you, and eventually they'll see what I see." Ara's breath hitched. "What if they don't?" "Then they don't," Kale said. "It doesn't change how I feel." She stared at him, searching his face for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that this was temporary or fragile or breakable. But all she saw was steady certainty. "I'm still scared," Ara whispered. "I know," Kale said, "but you're not alone anymore." The words broke something open inside her, something she'd kept locked and guarded for so long, she'd forgotten it was there. Tears blurred her vision, and she looked away quickly, embarrassed by the sudden rush of emotion. But Kale's hand stayed wrapped around hers, warm and unmoving. "You don't have to be strong right now," he said softly. "Not with me." Ara let out a shaky breath, and the tears spilled over before she could stop them. Kale didn't pull her closer, didn't push for more than she could give. He just stood there, his presence steady and patient, his hand holding hers like an anchor. Eventually, the tears slowed. Ara wiped her face with her free hand, her breathing still uneven but calmer now. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't have to thank me," Kale said. She looked up at him, and for the first time since the ceremony began, she let herself believe that maybe this was real, that maybe he meant every word, that maybe, impossibly, she was safe. Kale's smile was small and warm, and it made her chest ache in the best way. "Come on," he said gently. "Let me walk you somewhere quiet." Ara nodded, still holding his hand, and together they turned and walked away from the courtyard into the soft morning light. If this story moved you, I'd love for you to join us again.